Okay, in the section 3 of this OOPEx001 exercise, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be getting asked to section B, where we're going to be creating a user interface for our program. Now, a very important thing to note when creating a user interface or when running a program has to have a main class. What I mean by this is it needs to have when you press the play button and you execute your program, or when you convert it to a .jar, when the person opens up the program, the computer needs to know where do I start. And it does this through a main method. It will stipulate in the compiler which is the main method that I should execute, and from there it will instantiate whichever objects it needs to, and it will run the method. This term alone is the only term we're going to be using your Java main class. Next term and onwards, we're actually going to be creating a JFrame as our main class, where it actually creates an instance of a graphical user interface, and then we can work from that within that graphical user interface. It does make the instances and stuff, you have to have an understanding of that before you can properly comprehend what happens there. So right now we're just going to create a Java main class where I could also instantiate whichever objects I wanted to do, whichever user interface, whichever GUI or anything like that. I'm going to call this main class UE. I'm going to put it in the same package for now, and I'm going to click finish. And it says create a user interface that will create two instances and display them. Now, what you'll see here, inside this main method, there is a public static void main. And this is where it will actually physically be executed from. When you press play or when you run the .jar file, this is physically what will be executed. Right now, what will be physically executed is nothing. So nothing currently will be executed. Even though I coded this whole book class, there's nothing referring to it inside the main, so it would start and it would end. You'll see that the main receives through a string args. Now, I did go through this with my class a bit back, but I thought I might as well include this in the video. The string args array is very similar to the idea. If I type in ipconfig is an executable. Now, that executable, if I press enter, it will send through no variables and will give you your IP addresses. Now, if I go ipconfig /?, you'll see there that it sends through different details. It gives me what different / arguments I can send through to it. So, for example, here, if you see that if I go /renew, that will send through a different instruction and it will execute differently. And this is the base level of executing. When you run a program, arguments can be sent through with execute statement to make it do something differently. Up until matric level, you won't be actually using these string args, but I do think it's worthwhile understanding what it's about and the fact that it allows you to receive arguments through an execution, and then you could work through there. You could also then create different shortcuts in the graphical user interface. You could create different shortcuts which would execute with slightly different commands. For example, you might see in a lot of games you have a safe mode, which might run the exact same executable, same program. But if it receives through the argument that says safe mode, or whatever their parameter is for safe mode, it would then execute it with default graphics installed, etc., so that you could run it even if you messed up your graphics settings. So that's the concept of your string args. The first thing it asks me to do is it says to create two instances and then display them to the programmer and then the user. So what we're going to do is we're going to create two instances. The first thing we do is we've got to give it a data type, and in this case our data type is actually our book class that we created. So we've got a book class and we're going to call it B1. We can give it any name, it wasn't specified here. So I'm just going to call it B1 for book 1. And now this is the declaration part. We declare the variable. So we declare the variable. Now, the second part we would need to do is we'll need to initialize the variable, which means actually, in this case, the variable /class, because it works the same for both. But in this case, we're actually declaring an instance of the class. On this, sorry, a big distinguish here that I didn't distinguish properly here. A class is a blueprint for an object. In other words, a class is a structure. When you declare it and initialize it, you're actually creating an object. So a class is a blueprint. When you declare and initialize, you're creating an object. So there's a structure of a book. When I create the book, I'm creating an object. So the class is the structure that the book takes. Object is the actual physical instance. Now I'm going to go b1 is equal to new. Now this is where we use the constructor. We create the constructors so that we can initialize it. Now you'll see that there's a default constructor and then there is a fully parameterized constructor. So I'm going to use the fully parameterized constructor here, and I'm going to send through it hello world. I'm going to set the author to be whatever the lady's name is, Ada Lovelace. That's the first programmer, was a girl, and 120 copies. So you see I've sent through the parameters required, so this has been initialized as a new book with the fully parameterized constructor that we created. So this is the purpose of the constructor. Now what you'll see with b1, if I go b1 dot, it allows me access to all the other methods I created: setters, getters, the toStrings, the upsize, etc. Now often you might be asked to run the upsize method, run the set title, run the set copies, do all of that. But for now we're not going to do that. That will be for later. Alright, I'm not going to do the second book. Now when I do the second book, I'm just going to do it in one line to show you don't have to do it in two separate statements. You can declare and initialize in the same line, but you do need to be aware that it can also be done separately. So, and remember, make use of your control spacebar so your casing is correct. So the title of this book is IT is Great in Grade 10. It's by the opportunities. Okay, that's the publisher, but yeah. And the copies is 1. Okay, semicolon. Now, so you see I've done the declaration and the initialization of the object in one line rather than two. Both ways is correct. It's just sometimes you might need to declare before you initialize, and in other cases you potentially could do this both in the same line. Okay, so now we have created those instances. Now the next part of the question says I want you to display them to the programmer and then to the user. So firstly, to display the programmer. Now I say display to the programmer. Technically what you're doing is actually printing to the command line. Now the reason why I say to the programmer, often when you execute something nowadays, you will never or very seldomly be executing it from a command line. You'll be executing it as a graphical user interface, which means that they will not be aware of this. So often prints to the command line will only often be for developers and or for beta or alpha software testing phases. So that is what I'm meaning by saying print to the programmer. It's just saying that for those of you who have installed beta programs, sometimes you'll notice when you run your program, it'll also run a command line in the background with a whole bunch of descriptors to what's going on there. Now to do this, you use a class called method with a print stream called the out, and you would use the print, or more specifically the print line method, which will be sent through a string. Now that was quite a long way of doing it. Because it's such a common thing used, NetBeans or Java has created a shortcut. If you go your IDE, which I use NetBeans as my IDE, SOUT, you press tab, it will then automatically create your system.out.println. So just to repeat that, SOUT tab. Now realize if you go SO and you type wrong, you go backspace UT, it worked that time. But sometimes it will not work if you don't type it out from the beginning till the end correctly. At least in older versions of NetBeans, perhaps I'm not so familiar with this 8.0, and maybe they fixed that issue. Okay, so we want to print out both instances. I would preferably have with a line in between. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to say b1.toString. The reason why we created the toString was to sorry, before I go into that, you'll notice each method, it shows me what parameters it's receiving through, and it shows me what data type it's returning. And the toStrings method's purpose is to actually return a text representation of that instance or of that object. So that is the purpose of the toString. You'll see it returns a string data type, which is what we want to do, is because we want to print what is contained there. So now if I say this is not the print line b1.toString, I then got two choices. I can do a second cite, and I can then print out b2.toString, and that would print it out on each line. Or if I wanted to, I could also just go \n, which would add 2 enters, and then I could go plus b2.toString. Both of those would put an enter. Print line will put a new line character after the statement that you print. \n represents a new line character. We convert it to a single character representing a new line. Okay, the next statement said there. Now, interestingly enough, sorry, I keep on going on tangents, but if I just said b1, because it's expecting a string, it would defaultly call the .toString method. I'm just putting it there because I want you guys to be aware of it, and later you will find that sometimes you don't actually even need to say the .toString, but you do need to understand that. Now we want to display to the user. Now here we would print to a frame. We could often create our own frames, but there's a lovely, the whole point of object-oriented programming is the reuse of objects, or the reuse of classes. So we can reuse something someone else has created, and this is probably the actual Java team at Sun Microsystems, but the javax.swing. Now javax.swing is javax is a library, swing is a package, and JOptionPane is a class. So there is a class called JOptionPane that we can use, and it allows us to do various different frame-based operations that can get us information we want. And the specific method we're wanting to call now is a static method, like you can see it up there. Your API documentation gives you a description at the top. I forgot to zoom in. I'm hoping it wasn't too bad in the video, but you can see here we've created an instance, declared an instance, initialized an instance. I'm now doing the JOptionPane.show message. And what I was showing there is with the control spacebar, it gives you information about what you're dealing with. And it tells me that it's static, which means I can deal with the class directly. I do not have to create an instance of the JOptionPane to use it. And it shows the parameters, what they are, what we need to send through to them. To start off with, we're only going to use the first options. This is what's called overloaded. That will be get into in grade 11. We deal with what overloaded methods are, but you'll notice that there are multiple methods of the same name, just with different parameters. Now, in this case, the first thing that I want is a parent component. Now, we don't have any other graphics user interface, so we don't have a parent component, so we can leave that as null. The reason behind that is when this frame pops up, you want it to pop up above the frame you are currently in. So for example, like with me, I'm recording my second screen. I wouldn't want the message to pop up on the first screen, so what I would do is I would say the parent component, so if it's on this frame, it would pop up on this frame, not on my other window, which is in the other screen. Now, what we want to print is we want to print b1.toString plus \n plus b2.toString. Now, this could be complex, can look complex by putting it in here. So sometimes people prefer to create a temporary variable, put what you want to put there, and then inside your display you can print it out. So they do the exact same thing, because I'm never going to refer to this again, but potentially you might want to put in a temporary variable so you could refer to it later. But then I am displaying what I've shown there. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so that is it. But now let's run the program. So all three phases of our video here, tutorial, where we've created the class, we've created the methods, we've created the user interface, gets test. When I press play, what we assume that's going to happen is it's going to create an instance of our book, two instances of our book class. So it'll create two objects. It'll then print it to the command line, both objects, and create a message dialog. Okay, so I'm going to maximize this window, and we're going to play and see what happens. It will ask you, you have not set a main class yet. Is this the main class you want to set? We go yes. We'll then run it, and at the bottom here it will open up a command dialog box, and you'll see in the command dialog box it displays hello world and IT grade 10, and in the user interface side, and because it was null parent, it popped up on my other screen. You'll see there that it's got hello world and inside a graphical user interface message dialog box that the user could see. So this would kind of be a message to your programmers or your beta testers. This would be a message to your actual users, and it's a nice way of just putting messages across as with the message dialog, which was developed by Option Pane. Okay, this section here goes through pretty much what your test exam is going to look like, because we need to get this concept before we move on to other and more advanced stuff. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.